Hello and welcome. You are here for the ONlit book study of Strive for 5 Conversations. We're going to start in a good way with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that ONLIT's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care and for their teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. While we won't necessarily always have a giveaway at each session, tonight we do have this gem of a resource. Alicia, you are there. Did you want to introduce it?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this is the anniversary issue of Perspectives, which is the IDA teacher-focused journal. It's a wealth of fantastic articles, and so we will be sending a copy of this out to one of you lovely people at the end of the session. So stay tuned, and hopefully we'll be sending you that.
This is a good one. There's a lot of good gems in this one. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is our structure for the evening. Here's our agenda. We're going to welcome you. We're going to talk about the key takeaways from chapters 1, 2, and 3. We are going to spend some time looking at Strive for 5 in action, and then you will actually get a chance to practice some Strive for 5 conversations in your small groups. So again, welcome. We are here to talk about this lovely book. We're going to be going through the science behind meaningful conversations with young learners by using the Strive for 5 method. Strive for 5 was written by Tricia Zucker, a former early childhood educator and professor of early literacy, as well as Sonia Cabell, a professor of reading and education at Florida State. Those of you who may have been lucky enough to be at the IDA conference last spring may have actually heard Sonia speak. She has also been a guest on the IDA Reading Road Trip podcast twice, and those podcasts are actually linked on this slide. As for me, I am Melissa Monette Smith. I am your host for this book study. I'm currently a grade 1 teacher with York Region District School Board, but I've had a whole host of different jobs. I've actually taught every grade from kindergarten to grade 8, as well as being a special education teacher, a regional literacy coach, and like I mentioned last year, I was actually in kindergarten. So we are going to meet every 2 weeks for 4 sessions total. This week, we are going to be looking at chapters 1, 2, and 3. Next week, we'll be looking, or not the week after, in session 2, we'll be looking at chapters 4 and 5. In session 3, we will be looking at chapters 6, 7, and 8. And finally, in session 4, we'll be looking at chapters 9 and 10. Please join even if you haven't had the chance to read the chapters. There will be still some great learning opportunities as we discuss the book together. I say this at every ONlit webinar that my favorite thing is getting the chance to talk to other Ontario educators. You guys are a wealth of knowledge, and it's so amazing when we get to share what we're doing in our classrooms together. Just going to leave this quote on the screen for a moment. You've likely seen this quote that reading and writing float on a sea of talk. It's by James Britton in one of its various forms over the years. I've chosen it tonight as a reminder that oral language, in any of the languages that your students might speak, really lays the foundation for being able to read and write proficiently. And it's not something that we can or should ignore. I'm going to start off tonight with a discussion question. As this book is about the importance of conversations, we're going to start off by answering this conversation about purposeful talk. What are some ways that you can increase purposeful talk in the classroom? When I say go, please write your response in the chat. I'm going to give you a second to think about that. What are some ways that we can increase purposeful talk in the classroom? When you're ready, type it into the chat. Ready, go. I'm seeing lots of great stuff already. Think, pair, share, turn and talk, read aloud, different talk structures, talking circles. Just to plan for it. I love it. If you plan for it, it will happen. Asking open-ended questions. Math talks. Yes, absolutely, Christine. This is not just reading specific. Outdoor play. Oh, you guys are all experts already. Giving wait time. Very important. Free choice exploration. Wonderful. Listening. These are all great suggestions. Asking great questions for sure. Wonderful. We'll make sure to capture some of those as well. Okay, key takeaways. Chapters 1, 2, and 3. Key takeaway number 1. If our goal is to model advanced language that prepares students for reading, we need to have longer, more substantive conversations that contain opportunities for students to push their thinking and model more precise language. Rather than asking only one good question, ask a second question to elicit more language from the student. Be sure the question extends the student's thinking about the topic and doesn't stray to a different topic. This comes from page 17 and 18 of the book, and I believe it does sort of set the context for the whole framework of the author's purpose in this story. It's not that we're not talking to our students, but are we talking enough to our students? Here's a visual representation from the book that shows the turns one might make in a conversation. Research shows that many classroom conversations stop short at the third turn. I for sure have been guilty of this. I'm always seeming to be in a time crunch. I need to get through the lesson. I've got like 47 seconds before the kids are going to lose interest and I'm starting to panic. So I'm just going through everything. Here's an example of what that conversation might look like. What happened on this page? The student might respond, they were mad. The teacher might say, yes, good, moving on. If that sounds familiar to you, you are not alone. It's sometimes when a student might give us the right answer, we sort of affirm that, and then we move on to another student. And while the student is receiving confirmation that their thinking is on track, there is a missed opportunity to push their thinking and model more precise language. Let's take a look at the same dialogue, but upgrade it to a 5-turn conversation. The conversation starts the same way, with an open-ended question that has the student referring directly to the text in front of them, and the student responds the same way. What happened on this page? The student responds, they're mad. But instead of simply agreeing and then moving on, the teacher agrees and then asks a second question that is directly related to what the child said, but furthers their thinking and requires them to use more precise language. The teacher might say, yes, she's very angry. How do you think she should have acted when she got upset? This time, the child responds explaining their previous statement. She should have used her words. Finally, the teacher agrees again and summarizes what the child said, modeling more precise language again. Rather than asking only one good question, they have asked a second question. This 5-turn conversation took a matter of seconds and can absolutely be done in a whole group setting. The key is to start with open-ended questions. These types of questions can't be answered using only one word, so children will have to use many words to answer them. The book provides many more examples of open-ended questions versus closed questions on page 19. So if you're curious about the difference between, or you want to refer back to that, page 19 does have you covered there. Let's watch this teacher demonstrate a Strive for 5 conversation with her students. You'll see she's also using a classroom management technique the book calls equity sticks to help her determine who to call on. There are lots of ways to ensure that you aren't just using always calling on the same person. I've sometimes in my older students used the cards of destiny. That's what we called it. In my class right now, we're really working on breaking the habit of raising hands to help ensure that everyone's getting a chance to speak and to encourage students understanding that they have to play an active role in their education. Instead, they just raise their thumbs to their heart to show that they're ready to share. My ONlit teammate, Laura Bross, talks more about this in her language block planning webinar. If you're interested in increasing participation in your whole group lessons, she goes into more detail on that. We're going to play the video here.
All right. Our question we've been wondering about this time. What is scary to you? Number 12. Jeremiah, what is scary to you? Height. Why are heights scary to you?
Because I'm the way that I'm like.
Very good. I have that same feeling sometimes too, that when I get really high, I have that feeling that I might fall off too. Very good. And I want to know, what is scary to you, Kaden?
A spider. Sometimes I see spiders when they're out there and stuff. So, spiders are scary to me because they can actually crawl on you.
Okay, so spiders are scary to you because they can crawl on you. What else might they do that you become
They might
scared of them?
They might bite you.
Very good. They might bite you, so we have to be very cautious. Very good.
Bite you.
As you can see in this lesson, the teacher's patient and attentive to the students as they respond, and she gives them prompts as needed to extend their thinking. The book calls this scaffolding. Scaffolding allows you to tailor the conversation to the needs of your students. Scaffolding occurs at the third turn when the teacher will decide if they need to step things up a notch or step them down. It requires listening to the student's response and deciding if it is correct or not. Correct and clear responses call for an upward scaffold, and incorrect or unclear responses call for a downward scaffold. Let's take a look at these in a little bit more detail. When we are choosing to use a downward scaffold, we want to start with a minimal level of support. For example, we may change the question to an either-or type question. Did she lose her shoe or her hat? If this isn't enough support, we could move to a more moderate level, such as providing a closed sentence. When she lost her shoe, she was, right? Thinking about how we might get them to prompt that answer. Finally, when needed, we could use an intensive level of support, such as giving them the answer and having them repeat it back. An example might be, she was mad when she lost her hat. Say it with me. She was mad when she lost her hat. When scaffolding, we always want to start with the least intensive level of support. In this case, minimal, to see if that leads to success. If that doesn't help, then keep going. Again, the book is really great at laying everything out for you. There is a chart on page 25 that does provide more examples. We're going to be coming back to these strategies too, where I've written out the charts for you. Conversely, students who give correct and clear answers can be challenged through upward scaffolding. An upward scaffold ranges from requiring just a bit of a challenge to requiring more complex cognitive skills. First, we might consider asking the student for any connections or patterns that they see in the text. Then we might move on to an inference or a prediction. And finally, a more intensive upward scaffold would be to prompt the student for a cause and effect or a solution to a problem that's listed in the text. Research shows that during read-alouds, many teachers only scaffold about half of the time, which leads us to our next key takeaway. Take time during every read-aloud to stretch some conversations using scaffolding strategies. Remember, high-quality conversations with students are linked to better language skills. So if read-alouds are so important, then we must also consider that the quality of the book that we are choosing to read aloud matters. This list is borrowed from, again, a chart on page 70, and it is by no means exhaustive, but it can definitely help you begin to decipher which books would lend themselves to a Strive for 5 conversation. You want the book that you are reading together to have something that is value added. Look for books with meaningful vocabulary that will help extend their comprehension. If you're selecting a narrative book, it is easier to begin with a book that has a coherent structure that the kids can follow along. When selecting informational texts, please make sure that the facts are in fact accurate. That seems like maybe a no-brainer, but I have gone through books where the facts might be outdated or we have science to disprove otherwise. So it's one thing to check for sure. We also want books that will help background knowledge, selecting books that support the learning in their content areas and add meaningful learning experiences for them. Being new to grade 1 this year, I did start off my unit planning by thinking about how I could support their learning and understanding by building background knowledge on a specific topic. You can also do this for selecting books that support socio-emotional learning and books that are identity forming. In my class, we actually just wrapped up a unit on daily and seasonal changes, and we were actually able to read over 10 texts that supported their understanding of this topic. This week, I started a social studies unit on roles and responsibilities. And again, my planning involved, the beginning of it was just amassing a variety of texts of different styles and different genres to help me figure out what I wanted to teach to enhance their background knowledge. Lastly, please ensure that you are selecting culturally relevant and responsive texts. We want to make sure that we're giving students the opportunity to see themselves positively in text, as well as give students the opportunity to see others represented positively in text. Key takeaway number 3. As we strive for 5 turns in our conversations with our students, we support comprehension in the earliest grades. We strengthen their comprehension of texts and set the stage for comprehending later when they are reading complex texts on their own, whether they're learning something new or escaping into a story. This image might not be new to many of you, but it is a powerful visual and a reminder of how reading comprehension is a multiplicative factor of decoding and language comprehension. If a child can decode words but not understand those words, we don't have full reading comprehension. And likewise, if a student can understand the words but can't decode the words, the end result is still not reading comprehension. Our Strive for 5 conversations can help with this language comprehension side of the learning. This again is Scarborough's reading rope, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and this comes straight from page 44 of the text. Developing language comprehension early in a student's school career is essential to supporting their overall reading and writing development. Engaging in Strive for 5 conversations gives you the opportunity to model advanced vocabulary and syntax, help students think abstractly, and build knowledge of the social and natural world. This rope, again, is allowing us to visualize all of the strands and the understandings that come together to form skilled reading. And when we look at the top strands of the rope, we can clearly see how the Strive for 5 conversations can help bring about and enhance learning in these strands. The book clearly outlines on page 38 to 41. They go through each one of these language comprehension strands and explain how oral conversations can support the learning in those sections. So let's get into what a Strive for 5 conversation might look like in your classroom. One thing to think about is when and how we might engage kids in those Strive for 5 conversations. Of all the contexts for conversations that researchers have studied, the interactive read aloud is the one they've studied the most and the one that consistently benefits student language comprehension. In an interactive read aloud, the teacher is reading to the students and then they discuss it together. It provides multiple opportunities to engage in conversation, and they learn more vocabulary when teachers read the same book multiple times. This is enhanced with having a really solid reading routine. Again, Laura goes through in her webinar on 2-3 language block planning. She gives some examples of that. Those are all on the ONlit website. And there's one presented in this book here. Before reading, preview an important guiding question to give to students. This is a purpose for listening to this book. And as you read it for the first time or even on repeated readings, something we do in my class is we read one book a week and we read it over and over again, which I've noticed with my grade 1s has really supported my MLL learners in particular. But each time we read it, we have a different purpose for listening to that book. While we are reading, we choose a few places to stop to invite conversation. Those might be pivotal moments in the story or points where an inference or prediction can be made. And we pause and we elaborate on the important vocabulary words that we're learning, and we try and build knowledge about the book's content. These, of course, are things that I have selected ahead of time before we start reading that book. After we're reading, I will pick at least 2 students to answer the initial question or the guiding question that we had asked, and we can use the Strive for 5 framework. This is what we saw modeled in the video before. As I mentioned in my class, we do read aloud that lasts the whole week. I've also taken the read aloud outside of my language block to a different part of my day. Again, being in a public board, I have 200 more minutes in my timetable than my grade 4 to 6 teachers do because I'm not teaching French, and I've used some of that time to extend my language block. By the time we've worked on the foundations in syntax, my students are kind of cooked and they need to move on to something else. So putting the interactive read aloud at a completely different time of day has been really beneficial for them. It allows for really fresh, engaging conversations. I do that after lunch because I often will have science or social studies immediately after that lesson. And like I said before, a lot of my books are linked to social studies and science anyways. So we have a seamless transition, and the learning that we do with that interactive read aloud and those conversations that we have using the Strive for 5 model can be directly applied into our science. Another thing that you might do is thinking about the guided play. Play is at the center of our kindergarten program, but it's by no means just a break in their learning. Play has purpose in our kindergarten and can have purpose in all times of the day. During guided play, a teacher scaffolds the learning. You can transform free play into guided play just by joining in. You can start by asking the students open-ended questions, use the Strive for 5 framework to extend their communication, as well as their use of language. If you've listened to any podcasts with Sonia Cabell, she'll give sort of the example of a kindergarten class where a child is playing with Play-Doh. And, you might be inclined to be like, "Ooh, what color is that?" Or "Did you make a cat?" Or "You've done that." But those closed-ended questions mean that the children don't really have to use a lot of language. If you provide an open-ended question, such as "What are you making?" or "What have you created?" that allows that opportunity for that conversation to take multiple turns back and forth, which provides more opportunity for that language. Another way that we might use the Strive for 5 conversation is in small group. So again, this is occurring under the teacher's guidance, and students may be practicing new vocabulary words. They may be learning about complex sentences, or they might be exploring a concept more deeply. This is an especially important way of using the Strive for 5 conversation for our MLL learners who might need more support on the upper strands of the reading rope to gain a stronger grasp of the language. Sometimes for students who are a little bit more hesitant, the whole group setting is not the best way for that. But if we do it in small group, we get that opportunity to go deeper with them. Another way, again, is just to support and facilitate peer-to-peer conversations. This can happen at snack times. It can happen in center learning if you have free exploration, but it can also happen at recreational times. And as somebody had said in the chat before, you can use this in your content areas. For instance, mathematics. We're talking about those math talks. It's a very important time that you can do it. Okay. Here's an example of the Strive for 5 framework in action during exploration time in my kindergarten class. So in turn 1, the teacher says, "Can you tell me what you made?" The student responded with, "I made a stable for my horses." In turn 3, the teacher said, "Oh yes, I see it now. What are your horses doing in the stable?" The student responds with, "My horses are munching on grass." I was particularly excited that time because munch was actually one of our vocabulary words that we had learned that week, and I was happy to see that they were munching on the grass. The teacher then finished it off with, "How wonderful that your horses are able to munch on the grass. I bet it is delicious." So recapping what they have said and adding a little bit more. So in my kindergarten class, there was always an expectation that play was followed up with writing. So you can see here how the student was able to construct the farm and make a farm scene out of different toys. And then they were able to talk about it with an adult. They were engaged in play, and the adult came and inserted themselves in the play to talk about what they were doing. Finally, they were able to write about it using our playful learning template. Okay. So now we are going to move into this opportunity to get you going. But before we do that, are there any questions about the framework before you wanted to clarify before you started practicing with it? If there are, go ahead and type them in the chat. I think for me, when I was first reading this book and going through it, a lot of it was very much, okay, I get it. Yep, I'm doing a little bit about that. And then now, having gone through it multiple times, I noticed that in my class, when we are having conversations, that instead of moving to another kid so that all kids are having their turn, I'm going deeper with a kid at a time so that we can have a more rich conversation. So Lauren has asked, you've mentioned that the interactive read aloud went on all week. Do you mean you have one book a week and focus on the same one whole week? I do. So in my class, it's not the only book we're reading. We do a chapter book as well that I read to them at a different time. But when we are using that book, my interactive read aloud, I will use it a different way each day, depending on the day of the week or what the book is being used for. I will use it the same time, the same book for the whole week. That again speaks, I think, to the meatiness of the book, making sure you're choosing a book that warrants that. I've noticed with my kids, I do have quite a few students who are new to learning English, and by reading the book multiple times, they are able to feel more confident in explaining their thinking as we go through the book. So that is one thing that I do. It's certainly not the only way to do it, but that is one way to do it. You're very welcome. Any other questions before we get going? Okay. So you're going to be in breakout rooms, but before we do that, I'm just going to leave this up on the screen here for a bit. These are some breakout room norms that were created by an ONlit team member, Jordan Sloan, and I think they are important to remember as we get into group work. Okay, so here's the task that you're going to do. You're going to read an excerpt from the book Chrysanthemum. I've chosen this book because it was the book that my class was actually working on. I think it's familiar to a lot of people, and it certainly wasn't the only book that we read at the beginning of the year about acceptance and being for who you are, but it was one that was readily available to us. So you are going to read from that book. That's okay. I'm seeing in the chat, no breakout rooms, no problem. Just keep listening. It's all good. You're going to get a slide where turns 1 and 2 have been given for both the upward and downward scaffolding. And then as a group, you're going to collaborate on ways that the teacher may respond in turn 3 to elicit more vocabulary and deeper understanding of the text. I'm going to put the link to the folder that should take you to a folder that'll join to your drive. And what you will find inside there is you should find the breakout room story. So you see, I can see people are jumping on it, which is great. There's the excerpt that you have there. And then you'll see that the strategy suggestions will continue below. We've got some downward scaffolding strategies as well as upward scaffolding strategies. Also in that book, in that folder, you have the breakout slides. So it says session 1 breakout. You'll see that there are multiple slides. MJ, our lovely MJ, is going to be putting you into breakout rooms shortly. All we ask is that you pay attention to whatever group number that they give you. So if you're in breakout room 1, you're going to go to breakout room slide number 1. If you're in breakout room number 5, you can go to that slide. And you can see here that we have the turn 1 and the student turn 2, and that you can use those scaffoldings to help you. We were in that task and we were able to see from the back end that a lot of great responses were happening there. Before we bring that up, did we go through it? Did anybody have any questions or anything that come up other than the fact that the text disappeared magically? Were there any sort of insights, any aha moments? Okay, so here's what I'd like you to answer in the chat. Which did you find easier to support? Downward scaffolding or upward scaffolding? I ask that only because for me, I'm noticing when I'm talking with kids that I'm having an easier time extending their learning than I am in trying to bring about conversations. One thing that I used to always do is when a child was struggling, I would sort of be like, okay, who can help them out? And that's not something I do anymore. I really sit there in that struggle with the student and really try and use the strategies that they list in the book to pull out some learning from them. So let's see in the chat here. What are we thinking? Which did you find easier? So I'm getting a lot of upward easier. Yeah. Which I find that interesting to see which one's coming. And so sort of a clue for us that if we're finding the upwards easier to extend and the digging, that maybe that section of the book, again, these are all strategies that are listed, and it could be something that you could challenge yourself to do. We didn't get to upward because downward was pretty tricky. That's great, Jolene. Thank you for that feedback. That's wonderful. It's nice to I noticed that some people did start with the upward. So I'm like, oh, I wonder if they're feeling just more naturally inclined to that. But downward you found easier too. That's so interesting. So Christelle is saying, I find upward easier. Concern with downward is how to step down without giving them more than they need. I agree. That is something to definitely be mindful of. I liked with the book, the framework of the book, that they had those 3 levels and sort of could give you a little bit of clues to start with at each one, so that you're not going to giving them more help than they need. For sure. Okay. So to recap, the Strive for 5 conversations help to advance language skills, and by having the students think more deeply and use more precise language to explain their thinking. These conversations can occur at a variety of times in the day, but are often very impactful when they're included in the interactive read aloud. Before I let you leave, there is a reminder that our next meeting is on October the 30th at 7 p.m. and that we would like you to read chapters 4, 5, and 6 and consider sharing your experience for a Strive for 5 conversation. Again, if you have any questions at all about this book study, you can be sure to reach me at melissa@onlit.org, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. We do have some time now before we get going. I know sometimes it's a busy time of year though, so if you do need to sign off, that's okay. Wait to find out who the winner is. But are there any burning questions about how you might do this, how you might use this Strive for 5 method moving forward? You can go ahead to unmute or just add it to the chat there. These are great. These are wonderful questions. Very exciting. Okay. I'm hoping somebody has picked a winner in the background there. Congratulations. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always an honor when teachers are willing to give up their own time to come in and do some learning together. So I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks. So thanks so much.